Today's guest, Ananya Jahanara Kabir, is Professor of English Literature at King's College London. Professor Kabir models a kind of scholarship and teaching that starts from a grounding in a traditional field, in her case, medieval English literature, and proceeds outward through ever-widening circles to take in many cultural formations that may originate in pre-modernity, but grow to connect to present-day vernacular experience in places well removed from England, such as the transatlantic, Indian, oceanic worlds. Interests have enlarged. She has become an important commentator on creolization as a historical process, embodied cultural expression, including but not limited to dance and memory work. Professor Kabir's trajectory may be seen in some of her books, including early on, Paradise, Death, and Doomsday in Anglo-Saxon Literature, 2002. In the middle of her evolution, Territory of Desire, representing the Valley of Cashmere, 2009. 12 years ago, Partitions, Post-Amnesias, 1947, 1970. With Deanne Williams, she assembled in 2005 a volume titled Post-Colonial Approaches to the European Middle Ages, early example of post-colonial theory in medieval studies. And that extraordinary group of contributors. I'm kidding, because I was a contributor. Just a joke. From 2013 to 2018, she directed a large-scale project funded by the European Research Council, Modern Moves, which explored the global impact of African heritage social dance. And her monograph in progress, Allegra Politics, draws on that research. Fellow of the British Academy, has been awarded India's Infosys Prize in the Humanities and Germany's Humboldt Research Prize, and is on the editorial team of the new Cambridge University Press journal, Public Humanities. I mentioned our online platform, which you can find at shc.stanford.edu. We like to circulate recent work by our speakers whenever we can via our digital salon Arcade, which you may reach through that platform. Arcade includes a section called Colloquies, in which we gather recent work on emergent topics in the humanities, and in the colloquy titled Black and Brown Intimacies Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, curated by our colleague Usha Iyer, you will find a recent essay by Professor Kabir on the Dutch dance artist Shailesh Bahoran. Time to give a big welcome to Ananya Kabir.
Thank you so much, Roland, for that warm introduction. Thank you, friends who are here. Thank you, Eric Ortiz, for everything you've done in making sure I am here. And I am really honored, to say the least, to be invited to offer this year's Raymond West Lecture. For many reasons, being in Stanford today, about 25 years after I was first in the Bay Area, is a kind of homecoming. It's a sort of coming full circle, and I will be able to signal in the lecture points which will illustrate exactly the circuit, some of which, Roland, you have already alluded to. So without any further ado, I will launch into the lecture. And of course, I'm looking forward to your questions and comments, both from the room and online. So when I was invited to give this lecture, I was informed that lecturers, the invitees, are encouraged to explore the themes of immortality, human conduct, and human destiny. So when I was told of this preference, a particular sequence from Alvin Ailey's iconic classic, piece, Revelations, flashed up in my memory. And I knew that I wanted to center my lecture on it. And so let me begin by sharing this moment from Revelations with you. could, of course, watch the whole clip, but and maybe we can do that later when we come to the Q&A. But just to get back now to the lecture, you will recognize the image in the center of the slide now. This is from that very sequence that we just saw. And Revelations, as maybe many of you know, is structured around a sequence of African-American spirituals. And the one we've just heard and seen the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theatre perform to is Rock My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham. And so apart from the central image of them dancing to the spiritual, you also see some patterns. And let me tell you what these are about. Now, the patterns are actually from another artwork, also called The Bosom of Abraham, by Maori artist Michael Parekowhai. And what it is an off-the-shelf Swiss-designed light fixture. You can see the plugs there, transformed through customized screen-printed vinyl. So glowing from within, these lights begin to radiate these forms which are taken from Maori art. In creating this work, Parekowhai references the rafters of a warenui, or a meeting place, Maori meeting place, which in turn reference the ribs of an ancestor, whose bosom is the space within. In entitling his piece, The Bosom of Abraham, we are reliably informed by the art critic Michael Lett, who's written about this piece, that Parekowhai also references the very same spiritual Ailey responded to, Rock My Soul in the Bosom of Abraham. So in both cases, very removed in time and place, the phrase, the bosom of Abraham, actually also removed, not so much in place. I would say they're formally very different. One, we're talking about dance, the other is an artwork. But both drawing on this phrase, the bosom of Abraham, the phrase itself begins to accrue resonances from diverse quests for a destiny before immortality, even a destiny that paradoxically moves from thinking about an ever after to the here and the now. As he says, talking about this artwork, our meeting house in my Iwi homeland has two sides and a ceiling. It's got no carving, it's just little. It's not used anymore, but it's abandoned only in the physical sense. This is because we know we belong to this place. We carry its spirit with us wherever we go. Our living marae is really our suburban family home, i.e. wherever this Maori community and family is, the spirit of the meeting place is there. And he's talking about all this using or talking about the artwork that he's also called the Bosom of Abraham. So this idea of carrying its spirit wherever we go takes me to this very famous coinage by Robert Farris Thompson, talking about the kinetic arts of the African diaspora, which he calls the flash of the spirit. And this is indeed the same phrase that as a motivator of African heritage arts, the flash of the spirit, which dance scholar Thomas de France cites while describing the power of Ailey's dancers and dance. This is from a very wonderful book that Tommy de France has written on Revelations, the entire work itself interspersed with not just, the description of the work is interspersed with accounts of Ailey's life and art. The power of this flash of the spirit is felt too by a reviewer, Grace Sue, who, on seeing Revelations in April 2023, so a couple of years ago, at Kansas City's Kaufman Theatre, declares, I quote, "I felt I was seeing Ailey's work from the viewpoint of his childhood god of family ancestors. In Ailey's words," and she quotes him, "I am a Black man whose roots are in the sun and dirt of the South. My roots are in the blues, in the street, people whose lives are full of beauty and misery and pain and hope. My roots are also in the gospel church of the South where I grew up. Holy blues, paeans to joy, anthems to the human spirit." These are Ailey's words, unquote. As Grace Sue continues, born into the Great Depression in Jim Crow, Texas, Alvin Ailey grew up in poverty. His one refuge was the church and the music in it. Revelations is a tribute to the spirit of that church and its music, to what Ailey called my blood memories, the memories of my parents, uncles and aunts. blues and gospel songs that I knew from Texas. Unquote from Ailey. Continuing with Grace Sue, Ailey's genius was forging jubilation from the hard material of his childhood pain, and audiences cannot help but respond when everyone in the Kaufman is on their feet, clapping, swaying, and singing in time to rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham. It is clear what makes art matter, and Revelations an enduring masterpiece. Unquote. For Ailey and his dancers, then, as much as for Michael Parakawai, the Maori artist we just saw, the phrase the bosom of Abraham vivifies the abstract potential of their respective art forms. It is a potent and emotive vehicle for transcending an inheritance of cultural trauma and experiencing and experienced oppression, enacting and inviting immersion in the moment. But what, where, or even when is the bosom of Abraham? We turn then to the Bible and the New Testament's parable of the rich man and the poor man, Dives and Lazarus, in the Gospel of Luke. The rich man feasts, the poor man, infected with sores, starves, but the rich man goes to hell, and the poor man to the bosom of Abraham. It is a safe space, then, where the oppressed could gain comfort, its metaphoric charge constantly retranslated into visual interpretation from early Christianity onwards. And here you see just a couple of hundreds, if not thousands, of interpretations, visual interpretations of the bosom of Abraham. For example, in the Codex Aureus of Echternach, we see these three, kind of tableaux, each of which is illustrating exactly one phase in that parable. On the top, you see the rich man feasting. Outside the door, Lazarus is covered with sores and kind of looking in. But at the bottom of the third panel at the bottom, we see that the rich man is roasting in hell, basically, with all kinds of torments, while in the center, and obviously drawing our attention to the emotional center of the parable, is the fact that on his death, Lazarus is taken, his sore-covered body is transcends into the comfort of Abraham's lap, which is what the bosom used to be interpreted as. And you see on the other side another very famous manuscript where very typically, again, medieval manuscripts often have very gorgeous illustrations to mark the initial. And this is the initial D, where we also see Abraham with a cloth holding quite a few souls within it. Actually, in the previous slide, you will see similar depictions, one at least, again, carved in stone. So this sense, the bosom of Abraham in the Bible could be anything, really. What is interesting is, like so many laconic and often terse phrases mentioned in the Bible, they get picked up and elaborated on and richly visualized and imagined. And this is exactly what happened to the idea, the phrase, the bosom of Abraham. Now, note though, as the Codex Aureus tableau reminds you, the poor man does not actually go to heaven. He doesn't go to a place which is, for example, Edenic, or like the Holy Jerusalem, a city. He is actually on the lap of a patriarch. So he has gone into another space. And what is interesting here is that during early Christianity, there was a lot of semantic fluidity about the afterlife, and a lot of phrases, terse passing phrases, not just in the Bible, but also in the Apocrypha, were picked up, and they gave believers and institution choices in imagining different stages of the afterlife of the Christian believer. Between two finalities, death and judgment day, what lay for the ordinary believer? Now, we are not talking about the inveterate sinner, who would be plunged into hellish torments, nor are we talking about the absolutely saintly, who could be kind of fast-tracked into heaven even before the judgments of Judgment Day. But what about the ordinary person, the small sinner, the well-meaning person? Would they, what about them? And this idea of the bosom of Abraham came into handy, to imagine some sort of an interim space, which was not actually a place of even purgatorial torments. It wasn't absolutely heavenly, but it was still okay. It was comfortable. That was what the lap, the bosom of Abraham was. So, as the funeral mass for actually very early on, the Western Christian rite, mentions the bosom of Abraham within the funeral mass. So, for example, there is this antiphon in Latin. I'll just read out the English translation to you. Let Christ, who created you, receive you, and into the bosom of Abraham, let angels lead you. And this prayer for the soul, when it's at its most vulnerable, the moment of death, when exiting from the body, it may either be beset by demons and led off to some horrible place, or escorted by angelic choirs to a haven of peace and rest, or at least to the bosom of Abraham. This prayer is amongst a core of elements which is pretty unchanged from the Roman Rite through to its 7th and 8th century revisions in Western Europe. So there is basically a core called the Ordines Romani, which is contained in a Vatican manuscript, and then this gets severally, transcribed and disseminated all across medieval Europe, including Anglo-Saxon England, Frankish Europe, and so on. And in all these places, these manuscripts actually contain the very same antiphons and orations, which are basically saying, take care of the soul as it exits its body, and take the soul, hopefully, to the bosom of Abraham. Now, why can't they say take the soul off to the glories of heaven? They can't, because Judgment Day hasn't yet arrived. So there have to be some interim arrangements. And the hope is that instead of plunging into something horrible, at least let it be somewhere suspended in this lap of Abraham, with that cloth and so on. So the reason I know all this about the bosom of Abraham, frankly, is because it was the subject of my PhD research, and which became also my first book, which was already mentioned in the introduction. Now, amongst other things, in this book, I analyzed the funeral liturgy, the stuff I was telling you about, the Ordines Romani and all that. I analyzed the funeral liturgy of the Western Church early Western Church, to show that the bosom of Abraham functioned around this time before the 13th century as an interim space for the good soul until the Last Judgment. And that in this function, the bosom of Abraham as a phrase, it competed with certain uses of actually the same word that we use today, paradise, for a range of things. And so I call this very specific use of the word paradise, the interim paradise. This concept, I argued, I demonstrated, was later replaced by what we know as purgatory. So all this was in my book. I concluded my introduction of that book with the following statement, I quote, mapping the concept of the interim paradise onto the contours of different Anglo-Saxon texts highlights the recurrence of certain features of the concept within certain literary contexts and the absence in others. These alignments, I said, demonstrate that the interim paradise was a necessary, influential, and ideologically charged concept during the early Middle Ages and within Anglo-Saxon England in particular. However, its changing fortunes also provide a unique angle from which I said, view several ostensible oppositions: orthodoxy and heterodoxy, learned and popular sensibilities, Latin and the vernacular, prose and verse. I hope to review these oppositions as ongoing and intersecting cultural processes, I said, as the book proper was about to commence. But their lack of fit and non-congruencies also can perhaps shed light on the aporias of cultural history and the pattern of compromises and reappropriations that modulate both the anarchy of the imagination and the discipline of dogma. This was me, 30 years ago. I think, I'm kind of still interested in the same thing, so maybe not the interim paradise. But I used to be a medievalist, studying early Christianity as the link between Anglo-Saxon England and an imaginative world represented by networks of monasteries and manuscripts as much as heroes and monsters. My research taught me that with and in those manuscripts traveled Christian beliefs, both sanctioned by the Western Church and banned by that church as apocryphal. Travel and communication constraints in late antiquity and the early medieval period created a time lag between such prescriptions formulated in learned churches and councils and synods and the acceptance of those proscriptions in specific sites across Europe. What remains surprising to me then, and still now really, is the tenacity of ideas, stories, and images such as the bosom of Abraham. Despite the distances separating the places of their origin in the Near East or Asia Minor and the monastic sites of their written record and storage located in present day Switzerland, Bavaria, Spain, Ireland, and Britain, amongst others. These ideas, their genesis, their fragmentation, and their trans Mediterranean dispersal, all these ideas and tracking them during my PhD took me to the early schisms separating Eastern and Western branches of Christianity, the defining roles of liturgy, gospel, exegesis, and doctrine, and the mutually constitutive relationship of worldly and sacred nodes of power in deciding what was acceptable to whom and what was not to whom. Now, I moved away from this exciting world, I think, of the Middle Ages, not because I fell out of love and fascination with those issues, but because around 25 years ago, there seemed to be somehow no way to bring them home to my Indian self. Old habits, however, die hard. I did not settle down to becoming a South Asianist, per se. Rather, drawn irresistibly to the challenge of new languages and non textual embodied cultural forms, I turned to the Black Atlantic to study the expressive forms encoded in African heritage kinetic arts. Being a person who entered this world through the embodied arts, in other words, I was kind of enjoying learning how to dance salsa and all the rest of it as well. The social dance forms that Thomas de France finds at the heart of Ailey's inspiration, after all, Alvin Ailey is concert dance. What Thomas de France reminds us that concert dance came from lived dance on the streets, in people's front rooms, in rent parties of Harlem and so on. So these social dance forms is really what I was looking at. And I sought to theorize then what these arts mean for the compromised world of racialized and extractive capitalism and modernity born through those compromises, but somehow still capable of sparking that flash of the spirit. It would seem I had moved very far away from the bosom of Abraham until when one moment, someday, during a rapt immersion in Revelations, I was watching Revelations. I was confronted with the vivacious coming alive of a phrase that was connected with the very same personal traumas and lonely achievements of being an Indian graduate student determined somehow to make sense of the early medieval imagination through languages that many people felt were not meant to be her domain. In other words, many years after I thought I'd done with the bosom of Abraham, there I was watching Revelations, and the bosom of Abraham was in front of me again. So this talk today really helps me join those dots. When I was watching Alvin Ailey, the Alvin Ailey American Theatre Dance Revelations, it was 2013. What had now brought me to Ailey was this new research I was telling you about. This was an ERC-funded project exploring the global popularity of African heritage social dance. The project's underlying question was, how have dances formed through the traumatic histories of slavery and colonialism become a mode of exhilaration, joy, and self-discovery for people worldwide, whether or not they themselves were part of that African diasporic heritage? In answer, I coined the term Allegropolitics, which I bring to the talk today, and this term was kind of initially coined in dialogue with Achille Mbembe's very influential concept of necropolitics. Now, where Achille had used the idea of necropolitics to think about, the body that is oppressed to the point that its only claim to sovereignty is taking its own life, therefore the necropolitics, I found it possible to argue and ask, no, the body that somehow finds the resources for joy at that very point, vanishing point of complete, it would seem, complete kind of eradication of sovereignty. Actually, that is Allegropolitics for me. It's the flip side of necropolitics. The politics joins both ideas together. So the sovereign body, then I was arguing, was a body that could resist through collective joy or allegria. And I coined Allegropolitics because every salsa song I was listening to, this, every earworm had alegría in it. So it was like, this makes sense. So this alegría then was never not political. And its political charge lay in the ability to distend time and space. And I would say it was creolizing time and space as well. And in a way, I'm not really talking too much about creolization today, but yes, all these ideas were kind of forming in conjunction with each other. I'm very happy to discuss how allegropolitics connects with creolization in my explorations in the Q&A if people want me to elaborate on it. But basically, most important thing is that it seems that from thinking about the interim, I'd move to the now. How could space and time itself be distended, be creolized through the concept of allegropolitics? And archival work such as the unpublished papers of Mura Dane, I will talk about her in a second, in the New York Public Library, there are lots of things that help me, think about allegropolitics in this way. That's the book that's in progress, and hopefully it will not be in progress for too much longer. It will also come out of its own now very shortly. So I want to cut to the present. I was back in New York after a long time. Last November, I was back with Mura Dane and her archives, and I wrote some notes. I want to just actually read them out to you now before going to my dialogue with somebody like Mura Dane. I'm back in New York, after 6 long years. I got a new 10-year US visa. What better way to inaugurate it than with salsa, the breath and bone and sinews of the city and its beating heart, the Creole island of Manhattan. In between a conference at Yale on Saturday and a day at the New York Public Library archive with Mura Dane on Monday, I have a slender sliver of time, Sunday early evening, the time of snatched relaxation for the plantation and for the city. The time of New York's longest running weekend salsa socials, La Vieja Guardia and Jimmy Anton's. There are 2 of them that take place through the year on alternating Sundays. My Sunday here coincides with Jimmy Anton's, and so it is to the Stepping Out Studios on the edge of the water in Midtown West that I go. Dancing shoes slung over my shoulder, everything else squeezed into my outwear pockets. It is a beautiful late November evening. Its beauty out of joint, though, with what we understand as Northern Hemisphere November weather, and the blue skies that can no longer be thought of without the ominous frame of climate crisis. Is it this ticking clock that I now think of when I voice Manhattan to myself as the echo of Lenape, whose name still sounds on the lips of the world that all but exterminated them? Crossing Times Square with its pulsating lights and throbbing, feverish, exhilarated crowds, it is T.S. Eliot who provides my soundtrack. Hurry up, please, it's time. And then there will be time. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us make our visit. But Eliot did not know of the creolized connected rims coursing through this unreal city, or if he did, he didn't care. These rhythms could have rescued him, as they rescue so many of us. Jazz dance at the turn of the preceding century, salsa at the new millennium. I have arrived. I ascend in an elevator. With me are 3 others, also heading for the dance floor. As the music seeps through the elevator shaft, becoming louder as we near our destination, the air of complicity grows thick. Our bodies start twitching imperceptibly at first. In response, we smile at each other. We are getting ready for the time of dance, the time of the E, which is Spanish for and. Because if anybody has done any dance class, especially salsa, the first thing you learn is the and is extremely important. It's not the 1, 2, 3, it's the 1 and 2. So the and is the time of the now. The and is where we enter the E. And this is the time which transforms the gap between beats into supreme meaningfulness, the meaningfulness of the now. Mura Dane was born in Russia in 1902, then Odessa, actually, interestingly. And she died in 1987 in New York. She had danced at the high society balls of St. Petersburg and Vienna, and had learned ballet and modern dance in the style of Jacques Dalcroze and Isadora Duncan. In 1925, she saw Josephine Baker dance in Paris, and she wanted to follow her to New York, which she did. Like Baker, she hung out and danced at the clubs of Harlem and uptown New York, observing, filming, dancing with, and talking to the dramatis personae, the hep cats and cool cats who wore zoot suits, spent hours practicing steps with their partners in Harlem apartments, and turned up every night to outdo each other in dance to live jazz music by the greats Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong. The subjects of Dane's admiration and gaze were Black. She, like many other jazz dance aficionados, was white. The world of dance she entered was, in her formulation, their own land. Something about jazz dance made Dane feel it as a universal need that broke through the world of racial segregation and the dark history of enslavement that was still very much present in the memories and lives of Harlem's dancers. Shouldn't Dane's approach to Black dance be castigated as cultural appropriation? I find perhaps a more nuanced approach to this phenomenon of white folks watching Black dance can help us here. Dane herself once declared, jazz dance liberates us from the cramp of our tempo. I want to see jazz's reliance on improvisation, offering her and others deep and indeed shared resources against the debilitating temporalities of capitalist urban modernity. And I'm kind of juxtaposing her words and her film. We'll see a little bit of the film, one of the sets of filmed, she films a lot of the dancers. We'll see that in a second. I want to juxtapose that with these rather amazing and disturbing clocks. They are called the Blackamoor clocks or the pendulo negre in French. They're kind of very elaborate, patinated. There's a whole genre of these clocks. Ebony, gold, and they always show a Black person engaged in labor. That is the clock. Here, so actually, I find this, so they are either hauling goods or, as in here, rolling a barrel at work. But bizarrely enough, this work is the clock. I find this conflation really quite bizarre, and I'm working on this in my book. But most interesting, I find, is an example such as this, where the work being done by the depicted Black person, who is obviously enslaved at this time, that's the whole idea, the enslaved person is actually drumming as well. So there's a what is this work that the clock encapsulates? What is the now? What is the moment that the ticking clock actually records? So let us think about that time, the metronome of work, alongside the kinds of things that was fascinating Mura Dane when she talks about the cramp of our tempo, which jazz liberates us from. Although here we see our dancers sort of suspended in white space, where they were actually dancing night after night was the Sadai Ballroom, which was the legendary home of Happy Feet. And in the pre-civil rights era, in the words of Brenda Dixon Gottschalk, a very eminent dance scholar, a contact zone that ignored class distinctions, unquote, as well as, quote, a site where African-American and white worlds touched and merged momentarily, unquote. At the Savoy, Black people danced for each other. Those white people, such as Dane, who came to dance as much as watch. Here, Dane found finally what she called the happy embodiment of all this painful search. In the Savoy Ballroom, rhythm and freedom of movement, improvisation and humor were alive, like the times of Dionysian festival or Italian comedy. Satyrs and harlequins were actual and spontaneous, not a recreation, but a creation stemming from the same folk current which animated the great times of antiquity. Unquote. We can talk about the kinds of analogies she's drawing here or the kinds of things she's calking, her idea of happiness. All of this is up for discussion and debate, of course, but what I'm interested in following her, her quest for highlighting the improvisational quality of jazz dance, which returns unpredictably to the frame of time, even as some kind of non-linear conception of time takes over. This experience of temporality immerses the body in another relationship to the march of time by engaging it in a conversation with what Eurocentric musicology has termed polyrhythm, syncopation. These are terms that actually only make sense when you're comparing it with what it's not syncopated with. But these are features, in short, of jazz dance and music which derive from its Africanist inheritance, and they are features that first found expression in the New World on the plantation, where drumming and dancing were allegro politics. Bain's interlocutor, she interviews a lot of dancers, and they time and again remember the plantation. The cakewalk, for instance, is remembered as formed through mimicry by slaves of white masters. That genealogy then is enshrined in collective memory, and her interlocutors make Dane aware of it through their explications of how jazz dance came to be. Thus, jazz, in both dance and music, manifests this memory of original resistance to the time of labor by codifying these temporalities into formal properties. Some of her interlocutors call it spasm music. It is interruptive and unpredictable, spasmodic, but only from the perspective of another time, the time of the plantation and the factory. When festive temporality replicates factory time, the modern subject is defined in both work and play through the cramp of our time. It is only through the spasmodic, jerking, but vital body that the new, what she calls the Dionysian collective, the new collective of the dance floor, can release us then from both the cramp of our tempo and the dangers of reification that face even music by virtue of its amenability to technological capture. In other words, live music can be recorded, you can press that play button time and time again, but when you're dancing, each time you're dancing, you're releasing something that is of the now, of the moment. Now, I want to use this understanding of dance to move into my the final part of my lecture. To think about a very different time and place. I want to use the understanding of dance as a way of dwelling differently in time to take us to the riverine island of Gotharath, located on the terraqueous fringe that is the Malabar coastline of India's southern state of Kerala. Here, as you can see, a polychromatic statue stands 11 feet tall. Although faded through the annual onslaught of monsoonal wind and rain, one can still note the once vibrant turquoise green cloak, the red skirt of the tunic, and the yellow hauberk-like shirt covering the upper body. Clusters of multicolored tesserae are scattered across the cloak and tunic, and in very Indic decorative mode, march across the garment's bottom edges. Cobalt blue sleeves and hose are paired with tall brown boots and once pristine white gloves. Somewhat incongruous in this lush tropical climate. A bulbous gold crown on the head, also decorated with colored tesserae, and a scepter in red and gold held in the right hand, complete the look. The figure thus attired and accoutred is slim and fit with muscular calves and a strong V-shaped torso. His features are sharp, his eyes hold a clear gaze in the middle distance, and he sports a lush but neat set of upturned mustaches and curling beard. From beside his feet, do note the two ivy tendrils that spring. They curve sensuously around a bending cross that rises towards and almost meets the crowned head. The statue rests on a stepped square plinth. Along the base of the lower step runs an inscription in a Dravidian-looking script, book-ended by stylized etchings of a cantering horse with rider. Perhaps you can't see all that, it's out there. The cantering horse is down there, in that corner there. and a rigged ship. The ship is somewhere there. These emblems recur on the upper step. Again, a little unclear there. Together with the Christian emblem of a pelican feeding its young and a fish holding a plant from its mouth. In front of the statue meanders the Periyar River. The small Saint Sebastian jetty is right across, and the farther bank is dotted with red tiled buildings in Kerala Dutch style and graceful palms. Behind the statue is a grassy square, you can't quite see that in these two photos, delimited by an open air stage. There's an early 20th century church, the Roman Catholic Holy Cross Church, and across the road that runs by the church up to this jetty, there is the Holy Cross Primary School, housed in a building constructed by the Dutch, who occupied the Malabar coast until 1795, when they were ousted by the British. The Portuguese, who had laid the groundwork for European presence on this coast with Vasco da Gama's advent in 1498, had been expelled northwards to Goa by the Dutch between 1658 and 1663. With the Dutch had come Calvinism, and Europe's religious wars had washed up on the Malabar coast, where Portuguese imposition of Roman Catholicism had already transformed a complex religious and cultural terrain marked for centuries by an Eastern Christian rite. The statue, then, that you see is the epicenter of a multi-denominational and multi-faith history. On the other side of Gotruth is the Iberian Baroque Church of St. Sebastian. 4 kilometers downriver is a Jewish synagogue and Roman Catholic seminary. 8 kilometers across is the oldest Muslim place of worship in peninsular India, the Cheraman Juma Mosque, and just beyond it, the Kodangalur Hindu Temple, which is also the seat of the Reformed Syrian Christian Mar Thomas Church. Subtending the pre-modern cosmopolitanism of these religious institutions is the association of the entire area with the lost port of Muziris, connected by trade and lore to Mediterranean antiquity. And this is the territory of Karalzman, Malabar's Charlemagne, resurrected in this concrete and fiberglass statue in 2013 by a local sculptor named Anto George. Kerala's Muziris Heritage Trust had commissioned George to create the statue, and the statue is not of Charlemagne directly. It's a statue of somebody called Chinnathambi Anavi, who is a quasi-historical figure regarded as the creator of a performative genre, Chavittu Natakam, which is Malayalam for stamping drama. And within this genre, Karalzman Charitam, Charlemagne's Deeds, is the most beloved example. The statue and its scheduled unveiling during a new festival aimed at reviving this art form of Gotharuth was part of the Muziris Trust's larger plan to regenerate the area through strategic interventions into heritage. But creating a statue of Chinnathambi Anavi in turn created further problems. Who was he? Was he a Portuguese missionary? Was he a Tamil proselytizer? Because the language of Chauthanatakam is not quite Malayalam, which is the language of Kerala. It is kind of permeated, creolized by Tamil as well. So we don't quite know who was this Chinnathambi Anavi. And the inscriptions on the plinth that you've seen, that script is actually not a script at all. It's a faux script devised by the sculptor to mimic certain rock inscriptions excavated at the Portuguese seminary in Chendamangalam. So he's kind of making it up, and he's also made up what Chinnathambi Anavi looks like. He has decided to dress him in the costumes of Charlemagne as enacted in Chauthanatakam. His facial features he takes from locals of Gotharuth who act the role of Charlemagne, and who from the 18th century have donned these glittering costumes associated with Charlemagne, his paladins, and the Saracenic opponents to engage in vigorous combats that offer Indian Ocean World equivalents of Moors and Christians conversion dramas performed across the Black Atlantic. I want to show you a little bit of what Chauthanatakam looks like and sounds like. And this is a very interesting, a very well-produced little documentary by the Muziris Heritage Trust that tells you a bit more about this form. So let's see a few minutes of it.
சபை தன்னிலே வருகின்றாரே ഞങ്ങൾ ഈ ട്രൂപ്പ് വരുന്നത് ഗോതിരുത്ത് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞൊരു സ്ഥലത്തു നിന്നാണ്. ഒരു 200 വർഷങ്ങൾക്ക് മുമ്പ് തന്നെ ഗോതിരുത്ത് ചവിട്ടുനാടകമായിട്ട് വളരെ പരിചയം ഉണ്ട്. 16-ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിൽ മിഷണറി പ്രവർത്തനത്തിന് ഭാഗമായിട്ട് മിഷണറീസ് കേരളത്തിൽ വന്നതിലൂടെയാണ് ചവിട്ടുനാടകവും ഉടലെടുത്തത്.
പിന്നെ വെച്ചാൽ ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് ചവിട്ടുനാടകം എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഞങ്ങളുടെ നാട്ടുകാർക്ക് ഗോതിരുത്തുകാർക്ക് ഇത് ഭയങ്കര ഹരമാണ്. ഗോതിരത്തിലെ അമ്മമാർ തന്നെ താരാട്ട് പാടുന്നത് ചവിട്ടുനാടക പാട്ടാണ്, കൊച്ചുങ്ങളെ ഉറക്കുന്നതാണ്. ഇതൊരു തീരദേശ മേഖലയിലേക്ക് വന്നൊരു കഥയാണല്ലോ. അതായത് കൊല്ലം തുടങ്ങി നമ്മുടെ കൊച്ചി ഭാഗം വരെ ഒരു ലാറ്റിൻ കാത്തലിക്കിൻ്റെ ഒരു സംഭവമായിട്ടാണ് ഈ കഥ വരുന്നത്. പോർച്ചുഗീസ് മിഷണറിമാരുടെ കെയർ ഓഫിൽ അന്നെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ക്രിസ്തീയ ദേവാലയങ്ങളിലൊന്നും പ്രോഗ്രാമുകൾ അവതരിപ്പിക്കാനുള്ള ക്രിസ്തീയ കഥകളൊക്കെ കുറവുകളായിരുന്നു. മറ്റുള്ള കൂത്തും കഥകളിയും അങ്ങനെയുള്ള സംഭവങ്ങളൊക്കെയാണ് പള്ളികളിലൊക്കെ ഇറങ്ങി. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ ചവിട്ട് നാടകം ഒരു 500 വർഷങ്ങൾക്ക് മുൻപ് പോർച്ചുഗീസുകാരാണ് ഈ നാടകത്തിനെ ഇങ്ങോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നത്. ഇവിടെ എല്ലാവരും ഞങ്ങൾ നിർമ്മാണ തൊഴിലാളികളാണ് ഭൂരിഭാഗം ആളുകൾ. ഞങ്ങൾ ഒരു 6-7 മണിയൊക്കെ ആകുമ്പോൾ എല്ലാവരോടും 7-7:30 ആകുമ്പോൾ വന്ന് കൂടും. പിന്നെ ഇതിൻ്റെ റിഹേഴ്സലാണ്. നമുക്ക് ഏത് നാടകം, നമ്മൾ ഇതൊക്കെ വർഷങ്ങളായിട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന നാടകമാണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പ്രോഗ്രാം വന്ന ഒരാഴ്ച അല്ലെങ്കിൽ 2 ആഴ്ച ആ പ്രോഗ്രാമിന് വേണ്ടി ഒരു റിഹേഴ്സൽ എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാവുന്നതാണെങ്കിലും റിഹേഴ്സൽ നമ്മൾ കംപ്രസ്ഡായിട്ട് വെക്കും. പുതിയ നാടകങ്ങളൊക്കെ ആണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു 6 മാസമൊക്കെ ശരിക്കും നല്ല പ്രാക്ടീസ് തന്നെ വേണ്ടി. നാട്ടിലെ സ്റ്റേജ് എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ 2.5 മണിക്കൂറൊക്കെ നിൽക്കണം, ഫുൾ സ്റ്റേജ് ആയിക്കോളും. അത് ഫുൾ സെറ്റ് ഇട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഇപ്പോൾ ഒരു രാജകൊട്ടാരമാണെങ്കിൽ കാർസ്മാൻ്റെ കൊട്ടാരമാണെങ്കിൽ കാർസ്മാൻ്റെ കൊട്ടാരമായിട്ട് തന്നെ കാണിക്കും. പിന്നെ അത് മറ്റു രാജാവിൻ്റെ കൊട്ടാരമാണെങ്കിൽ ആ രാജാവിൻ്റെ കൊട്ടാരം, പിന്നെ കാടാണെങ്കിൽ കാടിൻ്റെ ബസ്, അങ്ങനെ ഓരോ സെറ്റുകൾ ഇട്ടാണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്.
അതായത് കാർസ്മാൻ എന്ന ചെന്തമിഴിലുള്ള പാട്ടുകളും അതിനോടൊപ്പം വരുന്ന ചുവടുകളും അതിവിടെ ഒരു കഥയായിട്ടാണ് ഞങ്ങളിവിടെ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്.
പിന്നെ തമിഴ്നാട് പണ്ഡിതനായ ചിന്നത്തമ്പി അണ്ണാവിയാണ് ഫസ്റ്റിലെ നാടകം രചിക്കുന്നത്. കാർസ്മാൻ്റെ രചന ചിന്നത്തമ്പി അണ്ണാവിയാണ്. പിന്നെ ഇപ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് നാടകങ്ങൾ മലയാള രൂപത്തിൽ, അന്നത്തെ ഭാഷ തമിഴായിരുന്നതിൻ്റെ പേരിൽ തമിഴിലാണ് ഫസ്റ്റ് നാടകം രചിക്കപ്പെട്ടത്. അതായത് ഈ നാടകം ഇപ്പോഴും നമ്മൾ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്ന ആ ഭാഷയിൽ തന്നെയാണ്, ചെന്തമിഴാണ് ഇതിൻ്റെ ഭാഷ.
So you can see that it's extremely vigorous, to say the least, and the energy of this form, actually it can barely be replicated on through this sort of just kind of showing you recording. But I was lucky enough to spend a few days at Gotruth in December, and these are some images from the actual performances of the Deeds of Charlemagne in December that I saw. I really found this absolutely, to say the least, fascinating. My scholarly training, it seems, has come full circle. I am drawn to Chautunatakam as a scholar who was once trained as a medievalist and now studies the Indian Ocean world's creolized cultures via the Black Atlantic and through the lens of Allegro politics as a way to think beyond Eurocentric paradigms. and epistemologies of trauma towards new questions of voice, embodiment, and time, futurity, pastness. Renewed appreciation too for the complex relationship between text and body. The folded temporalities of the Middle Ages are now inviting me to engage with spatialities of otherness and homing and bring, in different ways, the body back into the text. Actually, I find this a very beautiful set of images to show this is the libretto, this is the actual text of Chaudhanatakam, written and preserved by the people who are the custodians of these materials. So I now realize, however, rereading my first book after so many years in preparation for this lecture, because I wanted to go back to this idea of the bosom of Abraham, I realized that while I had thought neither of the body, while I was thinking intently of doctrine as power and textual traces of resistances to that power, I had kind of at that time, very, a few decades ago, I had not been thinking at all of the body, nor of time, in the ways that Alvin Ailey and the countless other survivors of the Middle Passage, named and unnamed both, have now taught me to grasp. Having stepped into the time of the E, the and having felt in my own body the liberation from the cramp of our tempo, I think I could actually sense now the force of the injunction, rock my soul. It's an oscillation, it's a shimmer, it's what capoeira calls the ginga, what Martinique and Bele calls bigidi. It's when you approach your opponent and or your dance partner and you momentarily fool them by just shifting in time, just when they least expect it. And that little shift, that rock, these tell us how one enjoys that feeling of bending time to accommodate and sink into the now. And to go back to this slide, the sweet touch of the world, to find in the break what Michael Ondaatje called the sweet touch of this world. And I want to then think a little bit in closing how I am really using now, not just, at one point I was thinking how the Middle Ages could be post-colonized. And now I'm thinking about how those medieval temporalities can make us rethink the post-colonial with something like Chaudhanatakam. Was very, happy to actually bring together scholars, young students from Kerala in a workshop that in December, we were seeing the dance and the performances at night. We were talking about them and trying to do some scholarly, methods work in the mornings. And really, when you're figuring it out, we are moving in the break, aren't we? That's really the method that I want to bring to all the fields that I'm engaging with at the moment. So as a closing gesture, I want to return to Michael Parekowai's Bosom of Abraham, that Maori artwork, which we started with, alongside thinking and enjoying the virtuosity of the Alvin Ailey American company. I want us to think about how we can draw together various legacies of modern and postmodern art, as Parekowai does. He draws them together with Maori culture and spirituality, as well as Christianity, to creolize our ways of knowing and feeling and being. Together with Ailey's revelations, that artwork allowed me to return to the Bosom of Abraham as a concept, yes, but also as a feeling and a space of collective security that helps us think and move through the pulsating time of alegria or embodied joy that cuts a line through the metronome of modernity. In difference and in similarity, both, we share, all of us, that metronome and the potential of occupying its interstices to create a new now. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. I had a question. I found the image of the and or the E really fascinating, and thinking about this sort of subtle or surprising moments in the present, or that makes room for the present moment. I would love to hear you say something about the future's relationship to the present, especially in something like the story of Abraham and Lazarus. I mean, there's something in that story, there's a joy that that story allows you even now, because you know it's a promise of a kind of future justice, but that you're kind of standing in already, or kind of celebrating now, because that story allows you to kind of glimpse what will be. And so I was just wondering how something like the future, or even the category of hope, relates to this kind of present jubilant experience. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great question. And absolutely, this is it. When we keep returning to things that don't quite leave us, we see them in new ways. So when I was a graduate student, I was so intent on finding the bits that fit, and, just making sure that my theory, or what I was deducing, was like the best way to, organize this messy material. Actually, I wasn't thinking about the affect or the feelings. It was not mathematics for me, honestly. I was just trying to get things together. And now I'm just looking at these images, reading those lines, and thinking, as you said, it's all about fears, hopes, and the now. And then the bosom, then, which is, why a bosom, why a lap, what it actually, especially in these beautiful insistences on the cloth, it's like a swaddling cloth that holds these souls together, literally. It's so charming, because it's like, it's okay, you're safe in here, and there is a frame for you. I find that the dance, thinking about movement, helps us occupy that space actively, rather than just saying we're sitting in there enclosed. And so this idea of rock my soul in the bosom of Abraham becomes super important, because it's really about moving around and in that space. And therefore, in that oscillation and that shimmer, as I was kind of saying towards the end of the talk, the future is folded in. There is hope. We, obviously, faith and Abrahamic faiths give us that sense of a hereafter, the ultimate hereafter. But this is almost like a counterpoint to that. In our bodies, we fold it in, and it doesn't make, it's not I didn't have time to elaborate on all the things that might connect it with the Chauthanatakam dancers, but they are also, of course, really, they are following the same, Roman Catholic rite. So they are. I could go and look into how the bosom of Abraham works there, but it is, of course, part of the liturgy too. So there's scope to bring these issues, into even closer kind of connection with each other. But I hope that somehow answers your question. Thank you.
As I expected.
Thank you.
I have a question. You did ask us to invite you to talk a little bit more about Allegro politics and
Yes.
creolization.
Yes.
And in relation to that, I was thinking about Allegria, joy, and trauma. And trauma also has a very specific relationship to embodiment, right? It's experienced through the body. To speak trauma has to come through the body in a way that dance also comes through the body. And so when Mura Den says jazz liberates us from the cramp of our tempo, I'm curious about who the our and who the us is. Can anyone enter the Allegria? What is the role? Right, the question of power, right? Who is included in the bosom of Abraham at different historical moments? And you had Sylvia Winter up there for a second, who is counted as human. And so,
Exactly.
and that some of us, or some peoples, often the one in the role of the oppressor is not able to break out of the cramp of their tempo, right? So I guess it's a set of questions that relates to your earlier work as well, because this is a framework that can be used for multiple contexts.
Thanks so much, Usha. And absolutely, you know, sometimes the danger of focusing on the Allegro politics is that thinking about the Allegria overwhelms the politics, right? And you know, there is this complete possibility of just going away thinking, well, it's okay, you know, everybody enjoys. It's possible to have a moment of enjoyment, but what has had to be sacrificed for that, or what has enabled that, and who is never able to enter that space, as you say. So we can only, I mean, I like to theorize, and I love to use my experience of my familiarity with the wide range of times and places and, you know, languages, etc., to draw examples from these spaces to create theoretical, you know, kind of propositions. But I also always like to go back and test them by looking at very material conditions of, of those examples. And are there things that, that, for example, if you talk about Chautanatakam, what you don't have or what you have, which you, arguably, of course, you wouldn't have in Mura Dane's setup, is caste. You know, the caste politics of Kerala are extremely, complex and strong, like anywhere in South Asia. So when we want to think about bringing Allegro politics or taking it across, say, from the African American or, you know, the Black Atlantic space to the Indian Ocean world, you have to reckon with caste. And I say that in ways that surpass and must be different from, you know, a lot of people are talking about how caste and race are now intersecting. For me, it's really about looking quite rigorously at how those social, you know, interactions in specific spaces permit or don't permit certain, bodies to move together in a space. Because for me, that's the frame that's holding everything together. I'm looking at spaces where people dance together. And in that, of course, there are always investments, gatekeeping, opening of gates, closing of gates, and so on. In Mura Dane's case, it was very interesting how, for her, she entered that space because she trained the body. So she had, as far as I can see in her writings, not always, but there was enough, shall we say, starting point was respect for that which she could not do, however much she was trained as a ballet dancer in St. Petersburg. And she gave the dance floor, you know, her energy, and she learned how to, and tried to learn, and also observed other people and wrote about them. So in all this, there was a dedication, and you have to have some dedication to enter that space. And that may be a form of people opening the gate for you. Interestingly, in certain cases where the dance floor is the paradigm for Allegro political connection, often expected power hierarchies are reversed. And that's also what I am tracking in my book, where I'm actually looking at certain dance forms and seeing who is dancing, with whom and how, and what are the limitations, and what are the kind of potentials of those invitations and crossings over. So absolutely, in the case of Chautanatakam, for instance, a proper discussion would involve the trauma of caste, for example, and how that's the body, you know, responds to it. I think there was somebody here in front as well. Oh.
There's another one up front. Thank you, Ananya. That was fascinating to me. And for me, a lot of your work crystallizes around the concept of creolization, of the merging of potentially disparate entities and the resolution of trauma through that embodiment, through that experience. And then when I saw the clip of Charlemagne in Kerala,
Yes.
I found myself thinking, because of my own training and experience of Abraham Verghese work, his novels, and I've actually never thought of them as the merging of disparate entities, but he says that a lot of his work comes from Kerala. His mother was born there and lived there, and he spent some of his life there. And he also grew up in Ethiopia. So for the first time, I found myself thinking of his work as itself the embodiment of a kind of creolization. And there's a lot of trauma that he deals with in his work. Trauma that applies to the specific discourse, but with which we can all identify because of our human experience. So I just wanted to thank you for that. I've never thought, he's right here at Stanford in the medical school.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and I've never thought of,
actually, I kind of forgot about that, but yeah, of course.
yeah. I've never thought of his work in that way. So thank you for that.
Well, neither did I until this moment. So thank you for that ongoing dialogue, Angela. It's I'm very grateful that you're here, and to hear your response to my lecture is precious. Funnily enough, at the time that we met in Bellagio, which was about 7 years ago, I was putting my notes together for Allegro Politics then. I used that time there. And it was conversation with John where a lot of the ideas about creolization becoming more than just an idea that was going to be referenced here and there, but could become a constant, like a cornerstone of the argumentation in dialogue with Allegro Politics. All of that actually came together in those few weeks, which we know for those of us who were there were very productive. But I really hope that it's a way, yes, to think about creolization in conjunction with Allegro Politics, for me, is a way to think beyond, through and beyond trauma. As, I mean, it's a way to not forget traumatization and the bodily impact of trauma. It's a way to, however, without forgetting it, moving around and with it. And that's why also the idea of dance as a distension of time and space helps me reckon with those simultaneities. There was a question here in front.
I'm really curious to hear how you place sound in this context. And when I think of sound, I'm really thinking of music, because music is evocative. It's also, you know, you can see various similarities behind the movements, and to me, music empowers the movement, and yet is evocative, even if it is a cappella, meaning the sound of bodies or the sound of alone. And I'm curious to hear how you think that fits, because I see a lot of visual and movement, and even the choreo, you know, the written choreography, but not the sound.
I mean, you can't have dance without some kind of sonic accompaniment, percussive, voice, instrumental. So I think if it seemed that the dance was being foregrounded, it's really because, apart from dance scholars per se, who obviously must work on dance, when people approach a composite of music and dance, for example, if you read a book on salsa, 9-10 times out of 10, that book will talk about salsa music, not about salsa dance. So I also did start from this position of noting that there were very many ways in which people could talk about the music sonic component of social dancing, but not the body and movement, you know, which was to me an issue. It was a fallout of the social part of the social dancing. These were not notated forms, you know. Now, music, I mentioned somewhere about technological capture and the reification of possible reification of music through technological capture. Music has been graphically notated, particularly in European influenced forms. And of course, this is, of course, you know, we know about amplification, we know about, you know, we know about recording. So modernity and the recording of sound and its technological, you know, kind of like capture has been a very, you know, it's a key cornerstone of so much of our thinking. Now, the point is that it enables sound to travel, it enables the reproduction and, you know, like a dissemination of sound, but it also conversely means that that which you cannot notate travels and is therefore fit for analysis in less easy ways. So personally, as a methodology, I have always started from the dance, and that's why you heard, and it seemed that that was there. But I assure you, it's not. It can't really be to the, you can't have. How can you think about dance if you don't think about what people are dancing to? So it's there for sure, but yeah, it's maybe in an inadvertent kind of, like in the hierarchy of what to discuss, it has slipped to the slightly lower plane, but absolutely not meaningfully. I'll keep that in mind next time I present something like this. I'll try to keep that more in the foreground. Thanks.
Thank you for this. A lot of food for thought for me. You gave me a trigger, an insight into the section in Ailey's Revelations that precedes
Yes.
the last section. I want to be ready.
Yes.
And you mentioned the idea of distended time. And you know how that solo man on the floor,
yes,
I want to be ready,
exactly.
the idea of extending and contraction. Then he stands finally, then he falls
yes,
backwards. And then at one point, it's like a liberation where he extends his body horizontally to the floor, but standing, you know what I'm saying? That I see now the connection with, I think I felt the connection before, but now it gave me more food for thought. This idea, I want to be ready to put on my long white robe.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I just, again, going back to Revelations and just seeing it a couple of times, the whole thing. Obviously we can't ever extract just one bit and think, we've got to look. So I did familiarize and remind myself of all the other elements, and absolutely, it just seemed like of course, it's a beautiful choreography and composition. Every movement has a facet of emotion. But what is interesting also is the combination of bodies on the stage. And that point, you're right, is a solo. And I think we could say that it really insists that we look at what the body can or cannot do, or actually can do, the absolute extreme of that contraction and expansion, as you say, before we come to the joyous collectivity of all of them, together doing something. So I think there is definitely in Revelations, but in other choreographed works by other, very important, representatives of this tradition, like Geoffrey Holder is another person whose work I have looked at closely. For example, his piece Dougla, which again has processional bits, solo parts. So there's always this possibility of creating a sense of a community on the stage by different combinations and numbers, of bodies that we see. But that contrast between what the group does in pairs and what this one person does, I think, and that idea of the long white robe, which is so, again, I think taking us back to biblical ideas very strongly. Thank you again, because I'm getting ideas to expand these readings from the audience as much as answering people's questions. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. This was really, really wonderful to see and hear and think about. I had a question about Allegro Politics and the aspects of social dance and the sense of these performances and dances and social situations and rent parties that you mentioned, and where people are dancing for each other. I wanted to know if Allegro Politics is integrally connected to this aspect of the social and this aspect of being connected to other people, or if there's an Allegro Politic at work when people are outside of those situations. So, for example, in the original clip, part of the choreography was portraying, people catching the spirit, which is a sort of spiritual practice that some people have in their prayer closet.
Mhm.
And so is that outside of being connected to others and gaining from others, is that also another aspect of Allegro politics?
For me, Allegro politics is fundamentally the way I conceptualize it is a collective. It's an embodied collective joy. So I feel that within that, of course, just like we discussed in the earlier question, there can be moments where we are experiencing something in our bodies as individuals, but there's a process of amplification and also this whole call and response. There are many ways in which Africanist, I think, kinesthetics gives us a great vocabulary for analyzing what exactly is going on when we make the move from what I feel in my body to what I feel because I'm there experiencing this with others. And of course, there are all kinds of protocols of coordination that mean we don't bump into each other or, actually we are coordinating somehow. And that's part of the Allegro politics, that we know how to move together while giving each person room to express their own improvised, shimmer, okay, which my little shimmer will not be your shimmer, but we are shimmering together, if you see what I'm saying. So there is in this formulation of Allegro politics, there is room for my individual flourishing, but in kind of like a cohort. So again, people like Catherine Dunham have given us very rich descriptions, for example, of her time in Haiti, where she talks about, again, the feeling of being caught by the spirit. But it cannot happen on its own. There has to be the drumming. There has to be the other, adherence. Certain people, she actually is very interesting because she's so conscious of what's happening. She's wondering, even as she's experiencing it, am I experiencing it or am I the anthropologist who thinks? So this level of unfortunately that split is but at least it's there, that she can record it and she can imagine a situation where others, so in other words, the moment of possession, the moment of being mounted by Loa only really makes sense when there are others around you, to support you, to rejoice with you, or to understand the solemnity or the enormity of the moment. So that's why for me, even the very individual experience of one person being chosen, one person feeling this, is a part of the whole. It is the ceremony. The ceremony must be found, but the ceremony cannot be found by one person because that doesn't make sense. I can't have my own little ceremony. It would be very sad and it would not be meaningful at all. So that's why I also find Winter's injunction, because if you remember the essay by Sylvia Wynter, she's using a poem, I think, by John Bishop about Othello and Desdemona, where he is imagining and then she is reimagining a situation where this wedding need not be a surreptitious affair. There can be torches and grandeur and, a procession. And therefore, the ceremony has to be found around the kernel, which is the two people in this particular configuration. So I hope that, again, gives a useful answer to your actually really important question. It's right. Where is the individual and the collective? It's the balance of both. Yeah, thank you. There's a question at the back.
Hi, I certainly enjoyed your talk and making association. But I'd also like to bring to your attention yoga. Even though there's a lot of movement in the dance, but there's also the body preparation for the movement and to take care of the body. And knowing that yoga can bring in so many different parts of the body to strengthen it, to stretch it, to even stand in a certain position and be totally relaxed or totally get in touch with the core of the body. So even though you have shown Alex Haley, can you talk a little bit much about the preparation of the continuation of doing these type of dances, because it's an awful lot of impact on the body?
Yeah, thank you. I won't talk about yoga per se because I've always avoided yoga. That's a long story. Maybe that's another talk. Maybe that's Raymond West lecture 2, but there's certainly enough to talk about, at least for an hour, if not more. But I do, when I think about yoga, I absolutely agree with you. It reminds me of protocols of the body, which are necessary in stillness as well as movement. When we talk about the preparation, it is also the E can also be a preparation moment, and the musicians, to go back to music, call it often the anticipated beat. So, before, this is very typical again, and it also is, I think, I'm no musicologist, but basically it seems to me that's also the basis of the idea of the swing. Things start before you think they're meant to start. So similarly, the body, you cannot do a proper movement of dance. Everybody knows that, however, even amateur a dancer you are, you need to prep the body a fraction of a second before the moment that you move into the execution of the movement. So what I enjoy when I see jazz dance, salsa, anything from this whole kind of, the kind of like that Black Atlantic space, to be honest, there is really that simple principle, which is obvious to all, that preparation is necessary before you do something well, is made into an art, and played with in different ways to fill infinitesimal, fractions of time. And those fractions are made meaningful in ways that are super important when you are dancing with a person, then, or with others. It comes in, you really feel time fractally unfold because of those moments of prep. So if you think about hip hop genres, they have all the ways in which the running man, but also slowing down, and then people just arrested statically before moving into the next. And so this play with time is such a kind of virtuosity of the Black Atlantic world, I think, and it has been elaborated on in ways which are really quite impressive and artful, not just necessary, but part of a repertoire, actually, of self-expression. Yoga, which I will just make very passing comments on, because, as I said, I'm not an expert on yoga, neither. Just done a couple of things which we all had to do in school in India, and probably that's why I don't do it anymore at all. But yoga for me, I think, involves a lot of stillness. That relationship between stillness and movement, I think, takes a very different form, and I would have to think critically about it to be able to say more than just that which is obvious. But one of the reasons I feel unable to go towards yoga is also because of the caste associations of yoga. And as an Indian person, I really feel much more, I have been liberated by the cramp of our tempo in South Asia by being able to move away from that world and it's like that gatekeeping, other gates have opened for me, and I've learned so much that I actually feel, that's been a training that has been very valuable. Now, if somebody else who is going to, tell me about yoga can convince me about the goodness of it, which I can learn from, that is when I will do yoga.